Welcome to our speakers and attendees. I am Tom Moore, Senior Advisor at the National Committee on U.S. China Relations. Technological innovation is at the center of the U.S. China relationship. Over the past 2 years, BlackBerry has sponsored National Committee programming on technological cooperation between the United States and China. This year, BlackBerry's generous support has allowed us to put on a two-part series on electric vehicles. With climate change of great concern around the world, electric vehicles, or EVs, are increasingly seen as one means to help reduce the world's reliance on fossil fuels. The first session of this series discussed the current market opportunities in both the United States and China. That program can be seen on the National Committee's website. Today's session will focus on the issues and challenges this new technology presents to both our nations. To discuss these important questions, we are honored to have John Paul MacDuffie, Professor of Management at the Wharton School and Director of the Program on Vehicle and Mobility Innovation at Wharton's Mack Institute for Innovation Management, as well as Ilaria Mazzocco, a fellow with the Trustee Chair in Chinese Business and Economics at the Center for Strategic and International Studies, CSIS. Guiding the conversation, we have Scott Kennedy, Senior Advisor and Trustee Chair in Chinese Business and Economics at CSIS, and a fellow at the National Committee's Public Intellectuals Program. Let me turn it over to Scott to start the conversation.
Super. Well, thanks, Tom, and thanks to the National Committee for hosting this event and the series about electric vehicles, in which both China and the United States feature as important participants in this story. And I'm delighted to continue my ways to collaborate with the National Committee going back to PIP and even before the Public Intellectuals Program. And we're glad that actually we have a PIP group in Washington this week, including at CSIS for part of their time. And I'm delighted, absolutely delighted to be able to moderate this conversation with John Paul MacDuffie and Ilaria Mazzocco, she's my colleague here at CSIS. And we've got a lot of ground to cover. We want to look at where the electric vehicle sectors in China and the United States are going, supply chains, infrastructure, potential U.S. China frictions, and the possibilities actually for a much more positive outcome, and what might be needed to get there. So with that in mind, I think what I'd like to do, since Tom took care of all of the hard work of introducing these two experts, is for us just to dive in. And I wanted to ask both of you a set of questions. We'll see if there's any friction between you or disagreements, or we're all agreeing with each other. And then we're gonna take audience questions. And I know that audience members can submit through the website, and they will arrive to me, and then I will translate for our experts, and then we'll wrap things up, all in an hour. So let's start first looking at how we got here today, with where the electric vehicle industries in China and the United States are, and I'm gonna pick on Ilaria first, not because she's my colleague, but because I like her more or anything like that, but just because China's electric vehicle sector is so much larger, but that's all I'm going to say. So Ilaria, how did China get such a gosh darn mongo electric vehicle sector, and what are the causes of them having so many?
Thank you, Scott. And thank you everyone for organizing this, Tom and everybody else at the National Committee for having us. So yes, it's true. I mean, the sector, Chinese EV sector today looks humongous, right? So almost half of all electric cars globally are in China. And when you look at the market, something like 3.3 million electric vehicles were sold in China last year. By comparison, the U.S. was just over 600,000, and I'll let John Paul talk more about that. Europe also a very large market, but also smaller than China's 2.3 electric cars were sold in Europe last year. So that obviously, that's significant. But just a few years ago, I'd say till 2015, really, China's electric vehicle market just didn't look that large. Even as a share of the global electric vehicle market. Of course, the global electric vehicle market was also a lot smaller, right? But what really changed was that a series of policies that the Chinese government put in place starting in 2010, 2011 really started paying off, probably more than any Chinese policymaker really expected. It seems to have taken many people by surprise. And I think that's because there was also a moment in the technology and the global markets. I think this is also a time in which Tesla starts performing really well globally, right? So there's a convergence, an element of luck, an element of technological maturity, and an element of really muscular industrial policy on the part of the Chinese government. And so since then, we've just seen, with ups and downs, obviously. Certainly 2020 was a hard year in many ways, but despite these ups and downs, we've just seen this market grow more and more. And along with it, we've seen all these Chinese electric vehicle makers really grow, as well as the supply chain. So nowadays, China is also a major producer of batteries that are obviously the main component of electric vehicles. So I think that's sort of, I can talk more about it, but this is sort of, I think, something to these are the things to keep in mind when looking at the Chinese market.
Well, thank you. John Paul, having grown up in America with internal combustion engine cars and driving around them, chauffeured by my family and then myself, but then running into electric vehicles in the 1990s or early 2000s, long before the story on China, before it took off. What explains the longer history of electric vehicles in the United States, but the more gradual growth of the industry here?
Yeah, Scott, you're absolutely right. The history in the U.S. of electric vehicles goes back a longer period of time, but it's been sort of fits and starts, or a little bit of acceleration, if you will, and then kind of dropping down, sometimes almost back close to zero again. I think in the 1990s, you had a combination of some policy push from the Clinton administration, probably most dramatically, California's zero emission vehicles guidelines began to create incentives for these American automakers to do something with electric vehicles. And, GM and Ford in particular had already been in their R&D labs studying electrification. Both companies have quite a few patents on electrification going back a number of years. So they were building up a certain amount of knowledge about this technology, and then some products were brought to market. Probably the thing that most people have taken about that period was that General Motors came along with a vehicle called the EV1, and then with the failure of EV sales to really catch on much at all, they decided to retrieve all EV1s ever made. And in the famous documentary, Who Killed the Electric Vehicle, to take them out of circulation, including crushing them if necessary, concerns about liability and the like. So that kind of put a certain symbolic stamp on that era, and not a very favorable one in terms of what was going to happen with EVs in the US. I would put the sort of second wave with the release of products like the Nissan Leaf, which was a small electric vehicle, very much marketed as a green vehicle. It was Nissan's decision to go with a pure battery electric vehicle because Toyota first, and then Honda had kind of grabbed the hybrid, the dual drivetrain Prius type of technology, and Nissan felt there was no point in them being third in that particular competition, that they would go straight to the Leaf. The Leaf had a strong surge of sales at first, and there were some incentives at the federal and also sometimes at the state level to fuel those purchases, but it also didn't have a lasting or long effect. I think its appeal was somewhat limited to people who were looking for a green purchase. Its range was limited. its space was limited. It didn't fit the U.S. market all that well. And you have a state like Georgia passing legislation to make the owners of Leafs pay additional tax because they weren't paying the gasoline tax, as another sign of policy headwinds as opposed to tailwinds. I think the third chapter is really the intertwined story of Tesla and China. So, I mean, the China developments weren't that visible in the US to the consumer, but they certainly were to US companies who have joint ventures in China. So this tremendous policy push that Ilaria spoke of in China and the development of that market was noted and attracted attention from the US automakers. But Tesla was really the thing that captured the public imagination. And of course, the drama of Tesla, of its stock price, of its fans and its haters, the short sellers, et cetera, through the mid of the 2010s. But 2018 was kind of a real testing point when the Model 3 was ready to break through as a more mass market offering from Tesla. And the question was, could they manufacture it at scale? They're having tremendous difficulties pulling that off, but finally they did. And then Tesla becomes a dominant force, not just in the US, but really worldwide, because they're competing very successfully with luxury makers like Mercedes and BMW in Europe. They get permission from the Chinese government to open a plant in Shanghai. They announced plants in Germany and Austin, Texas. So it's on the strength of that momentum that this latest wave, and I'm sure we'll talk more about it, propelled by national policy from the Biden administration, big strategic commitments from companies like GM and Ford, big domestic investments, big technological advances, all that propels the current state.
Yeah. Really interesting evolution, and actually shows that the evolution in the two countries is intertwined, not entirely separate stories. And I guess Ilaria is definitely right. The U.S. much smaller number of sales, but the last 2 years increased quite a bit in each of the last 2 years. So the U.S. is starting to move up the curve. When I started looking at electric vehicles, 2017 or so, one of the things that caught my eye and made me hesitant to say, this was a sector that was going to make it, is that up to that point, no electric vehicle maker had ever been profitable. I mean, BYD had been profitable, but not its electric vehicle side, the other parts of BYD. And I don't think Tesla had yet to turn a profit by then. And none of the other Chinese car makers had. But now, as far as I understand, making profits from electric vehicles isn't that surprising or crazy. They actually do. Maybe the story for the United States is obvious. It's going to, if you're going to pick your most interesting electric vehicle maker, maybe it would be Tesla, but maybe there's some other car companies or battery makers out in the US that would be super interesting. I'm just wondering if each of you could pick a story of a company, whether it's an electric vehicle maker or a parts maker, battery maker, that you find particularly compelling, that sort of shows this arc of what Ilaria described since 2015, really a change in China, and what you described, John Paul, as this change over the last 3 years in the United States. Why don't we maybe we'll start with John Paul this time, and then Ilaria let you follow up.
Well, I have talked about Tesla some already. I know Tesla has such fervent fans, mostly fans these days, that they'd be happy to have me talk more and more about Tesla. But I'm going to take the opportunity to highlight something different, which is something I think is quite fascinating, partly because it highlights the competition between newcomers or new startups and incumbents. And that's the electric pickup competition right now between Rivian, which is a brand new company and had its IPO not long ago. This is a MIT grad who's had this dream of an electric pickup company, and they're in early production. And then Ford, whose F-150 pickup truck has been the largest selling vehicle in America going back to, I believe, the 1950s, and who are the first to get a full electric pickup product into the US market, the F-150 Lightning. A huge amount of excitement about that, lots of advance orders, lots of amazing actually reviews from the trade press for both of those products, but a lot of admiration for Ford positioning this vehicle as a kind of comeback for a domestic automaker. Their appeal to the commercial customer, which is a big part of the F-150 customer base, that you can bring this onto the job site, you can run your electric tools off of the battery while you're there. A lot of other support services that they're doing. Ford has seemed quite sure-handed in their moves towards this exciting product plus bundled services, which has not always been a strong suit for the US domestic companies. So I think, and Rivian has to overcome that production challenge that Tesla had before. So I think watching what happens with Rivian and the Ford F-150 Lightning is going to be extremely fascinating. I frankly would hope that the market is going to be big enough to just lift both boats in that area, and then GM will come along with its Silverado, maybe Dodge eventually with its electric Ram. That's what I'm watching.
Cool, very, very neat, and it's good to see that there's still significant competition and there's not just one obvious winner in all of this. Ilaria, what company or companies in China excite you?
Yes. Well, first I'll say I saw my first Rivian a couple of weeks ago, and I was very excited here in DC. So that was, well, so I think I have a very soft spot for BYD. I think there've been a lot of newcomers and a lot of startups in China that have been making very nice, exciting vehicles. But BYD has been sort of there from the beginning. From the beginning in terms of electric vehicle, sort of the rise of electric vehicles in China. And so it's really, I think, its story really sort of, it's really emblematic of the development of electric vehicles in China more broadly. Also, they have a variety of products. So they make buses, which have been a really big, electric buses have been part of the story in China, not so much in the US. And they've been actually very successful abroad as well, which is, we often get the question of whether Chinese electric vehicle makers are succeeding in exporting vehicles abroad. And when it comes to buses, they are, and BYD is one of them. But I think, so more generally, it is a company that really leveraged very successfully its relationship with the city government, which was very important in the initial stages of China's electric vehicle policy. Like local governments, city governments were really important, but then it really managed to go to have a success nationwide. And I was just looking at the numbers for the last quarter the first quarter of 2022, and 25% of sales of electric vehicle sales went to the brand of BYD. So they may not have the number one electric vehicle in terms of sales, but they have number of vehicles on the top 10. And I think that's really remarkable, right? The variety of vehicles and the fact that they've been able to produce vehicles that the average Chinese citizen wants to buy. And I find that quite compelling. So that's
that
the
is
company
super
I look
interesting.
after.
Cool. Well, it's always good to go with one that's been there for a while. And I visited BYD. They drove me around in their electric vehicles, and they stomped on the accelerator, not the gas. And we definitely bolted forward like we were on the beginning of a roller coaster ride. Let me ask a little bit about one element of the industry which folks know about, but you don't think about it until you need it, and that's the infrastructure. We all know that one of the anxieties that people have about buying an electric vehicle is their fear that they won't be able to find a place to charge it, or that it's complicated, it's difficult, they'll be stuck on the highway or downtown or someplace else. What's the story of infrastructure in China in terms of making it ubiquitous? Is it ubiquitous? What do they still need to do? What's the policies to get it there? Is it basically, been given to private companies to decide to invest in infrastructure, or is this state-owned enterprises, state government agencies? How does China roll out infrastructure?
Yeah, so I think there's been a various stages. So initially, this was a very much a not just state-owned, but utility-driven process. So it was really driven by State Grid and China Southern Grid. But then it has opened up to both state-owned companies, private companies, and even foreign investors, although that they're not as present, obviously. But I'd say in some ways China is at the forefront of this because there's been such a growth in the sales. So some of the issues that China has been grappling with are the same issues that now the U.S. will be grappling with, and Europe is certainly grappling with as well. So there's been a very rapid expansion of the charging infrastructure. I believe at this point, in terms of public chargers, some of the major cities are doing pretty well, but it's always a catch-up race, right? The more vehicles you sell, the lower, right? Usually you calculate the ratio of how many electric vehicles are there per charger, right? And you don't want that ratio to go up too much, but the more vehicles you sell, the more you have to keep building up the infrastructure. So in a way, it's almost like it's, I don't want to say it's a lost battle, but it's a battle that needs to keep, you need to keep running to catch up, right? So just a few years ago, when I was in China doing field work, I remember people telling me how well Europe was doing. Well, now if you look at the numbers in Europe, they don't look very good at all. But that's just because so many vehicles have been sold, and I think that's just a natural problem. And I think that's going to continue to be a challenge that China, as well as other countries, are going to have to face. And there's been some creativity in China. The battery swapping, that's something that's really no other country has developed so much as China has, and that's really sort of a stopgap solution, right? And it's supposed to provide some comfort to consumers or taxi drivers that they can find some sort of solution if they can't get a charger or fast charger, right? So I think we'll continue to see these things. I think the government has been really pushing to expand investment in this. So there's public investment. They're trying to attract more private investment. We'll see exactly how this ends up developing. There's a lot of need also for land, right? So a lot of local governments are really involved in this. So you might end up seeing some differences in how different localities end up dealing with it. And I think we'll continue to see unevenness big cities are probably going to have much better infrastructure than rural areas. But I think that's the same in places that are more market driven, which China certainly is not.
Yeah. So John Paul, what's the story in the U.S. and one of the questions that I'm wondering about is our electric grid, because if you want to have supercharging, rapid charging that doesn't take several hours, that's a lot of electricity you need at a certain moment, and we have usage problems, and we saw what happened in Texas last year with their electric grid, and we have those are regulated by the states, and we don't really have a national grid per se. But if you want to persuade me living in Falls Church, Virginia, to buy an electric vehicle, I'm going to want to drive it to New Mexico. I may never go to New Mexico, but I need to feel like I could drive to New Mexico if I wanted. So where are we in being able to persuade me to go forward with my purchase?
Yeah. I mean, the first quick answer to you would be probably buy a Tesla, because they have these dedicated superchargers. They have more of them than anyone else. Until recently, they've only been for Tesla customers, and they have great software for plotting your drive to New Mexico. So, but it's a bigger issue than that, obviously. I mean, there are eternal aspects of this infrastructure question, and particularly the chicken and egg problem that you've both been alluding to. And I also think there's some subtle shifts in the issue over time, and let me speak to that a little bit. I mean, the batteries are getting supporting bigger range, and they're also getting cheaper, and so it's much easier and there's way more products available in the market. So it's way easier for a consumer to buy a product that at least from a certain, rational point of view, has plenty of battery range to get you through your whole week's commute. 20 to 40 miles per day is what typical U.S. usage of a car is. And so multiply that times 5 or even times 7, and there's plenty of vehicles that have that. Now, range anxiety is not about rationality, but that helps. Second of all, the truth is that the best solution for charging at the moment in the US, but maybe in most countries, is people charging at home. People who have a place to park their car at home and they charge at home overnight. They don't need a supercharger at the level of these Tesla products. You need basically a 220 volt line, which is like what you would need for your clothes dryer. Getting it installed, dealing with the grid and regulations, that's a slightly different issue. But the early appeal of these vehicles, let's say, was thought to be environmentalists living in big cities, and they had the biggest dilemmas with where to charge them. But, Ford F-150 Lightnings are going to be bought by people who live in rural areas and live in the suburbs, and they'll have to push through a certain amount of complexity, but they can get that home charger installed. They can charge overnight. They don't have to even worry about getting through the week because every night they can just top it up. And that's really the model with charging. You don't wait until your gas tank is low and then you refill it all at once when you go to Costco and get the cheap rates. You just top it up all the time, and then you don't have so much of that worry. So, of course, it leaves all the places that aren't going to be supported by home charging. And that's where I think public policy has the biggest role to play. We should have interstate highways that are getting a lot of investment in charging for people on long trips. Those probably should be superchargers. Whether to wait for the market to provide that or to boost it with public policy, I think in a way the answer is in, because the infrastructure bill that did pass with bipartisan support that's still being worked out in committee does have a lot of money for EV charging. There was more in other bills that the Democrats have not succeeded in passing, but it's enough to get it started. Things like multifamily, multi-use commercial buildings in cities are a more complicated place. Parking garages at work or parking places at work, these are all where we have to see gains as well. I think that's going to be a mix of probably some public policy incentives and market-driven change. The automakers that are selling all these vehicles have an incentive to help have the infrastructure develop at the same time. So I think suddenly is a lot of things pushing towards more infrastructure at the same time, whereas for a while we were stuck in the chicken and egg dilemma.
All right, I want to ask one more question just about the trajectory of the industry and where it's come in the U.S., China, and elsewhere. And then I want to turn to some areas of potential friction in the U.S. China relationship and what that might mean. But what I guess I just want to know, sort of bottom line, have we crossed the tipping point? Are we there? Is the electric, is it possible in 5 years we'll no one will buy an electric vehicle anymore, or are we basically beyond that point? People don't really, they've gotten over the fact that it's not gas powered and they don't hear the engine roar and all of that stuff. And we've done it. Now it's really, they're at 5% of total cars or something in China, or 10. And, we should expect it to get to 50 and, then traditional internal combustion engine vehicles are basically going to gradually fade away, at least at small scale. Is that over? Is that a guaranteed thing, or could something really go wrong and we don't actually have that future? John, Paul?
Technology forecasting is notoriously dangerous to do, but you've asked for one. I think that the chance of it ramping back down towards zero is extremely low. So it's really a matter of what kind of inflection point in the slope would you consider a tipping point. I think the genie is out of the bottle, to keep, using some different metaphors. There's a bunch of things related to national and international policies on emissions reduction that provide one kind of driving force. You have a lot of companies now kind of across the spectrum of the global automotive industry giving goals and strategies to put a lot of product into the marketplace. That's a variety of product that will appeal to a lot more consumers. It's not really having to sell these vehicles on the basis of an environmental argument. There's the fun to drive. There's the amazing acceleration. There's all the other things that are going to start really catching on. Dodge Chrysler, which is now part of Stellantis, they're going to be marketing American e-muscle, just so they don't have to use the dreaded words electric vehicles, which may sound a little too green and a little too liberal. So I think we're at a stage where we're going to see really differentiated product offerings, differentiated marketing, a bunch of policies that will help support it. Could it be slowed down? Sure. Is there a strongly competing other green technology like fuel cells for passenger cars? I think that particular competition is past at the moment. I think fuel cells go into trucks and buses and large commercial vehicles, but not into passenger cars. So to me, I would say, if you don't pin me to a specific steepness of slope, I would say, yes, we're past a certain tipping point.
Ilaria, do you agree? Is that what it looks like in China and other parts of the world?
Yeah, I completely agree. And I think, as we said before, in some ways, the US is lagging. So if we've reached that tipping point in the US, I think we definitely reached it in Europe and China. I think the rest of the world, much more complicated picture, right? I think in many countries, the grid maybe is not as reliable. It's going to maybe take a little bit longer. But I think when you look at China and Europe, I think to reiterate what John Paul just said, also companies have now invested a lot of money in this technology. So I just don't see them taking a step back and foregoing all that investment. So I think at this point, policy in China and Europe, and to a certain extent in the US and California, has really pushed companies to have a bigger stake in this technology. And I think that we've reached that point.
That's really interesting. All right. Let me now turn to what will be a controversial way to think about this, at least sitting in Washington, D.C. And that has to do with industrial policy. And we've both referred to it by one name or another, the market or incentives or state, public involvement. And, by the math that I've done with my program over the years, we found that the Chinese have spent somewhere around 1 trillion renminbi on subsidies in one way or the other for reimbursements for purchasing or infrastructure, government procurement, taxes, and things like that. Now, it's my own number. It's not an official number. And Ilaria tracks that better than me, and that's definitely a smaller number. And when Washington, D.C. has a conversation about China and subsidies, usually it's not one of admiration. Usually it's one of criticism. But what you all just described is sounds like a success story. You might say Chinese subsidies catalyzed the global development of the electric vehicle sector. But maybe that's not true. In Washington, we often hear folks talk about the solar industry. And, all major solar makers are in China now after massive subsidies that the Chinese provided. And what we have in the US are solar panel installers. But how do you look at the question of industrial policy and subsidies? Glass half full, glass half empty? How do you weigh that? Maybe we'll start with Ilaria, since the subsidies that the Chinese put forth is so huge and are supposed to either be attacked or welcomed because of their role.
Thank you, Scott, for this very difficult question. So I would split the answer into two. Since your question was unfair, I'm going to give an unfair answer. So I think there's two ways of looking at this, right? I mean, I think there's subsidies that actually go towards promoting the switch among consumers from internal combustion engine to electric vehicle, right? And we've seen this in many countries, right? I think Norway is the sort of the model for this in some ways. And in that sense, there's probably distortive effects, but this is basically I don't think that is quite as controversial, right? So what's controversial, I think, is actually the targeting of using those subsidies and other measures to actually benefit domestic producers. And that China has done quite successfully, I'd say, considering that up until the rise of electric vehicles, China really didn't have a wholly owned Chinese company that was quite as competitive or was considered as, quite so promising. And now there's multiple ones, right? So in that sense, that's the part that's the more controversial. It's been somewhat successful, although I think the jury's still out, right? I think that when we'll really know if these companies can compete internationally is when we see them competing internationally, and we just haven't seen that really yet. I mean, there's a few thousand Chinese electric vehicles that have been sold in Europe, but I don't think that we know whether or not that's going to be a sustained success, right? And then getting to the question of the cost, right? This is a cost that the Chinese taxpayers bore, and in some ways it may have been very wasteful. It may have succeeded, and I think the question is, will having these successful Chinese companies in this new technology, will that pay off? Will that be enough to justify that huge cost to the Chinese government? And I don't know that we'll ever know the answer, to be perfectly honest, right? I don't know that we'll know it, but I think it's worth keeping in mind that it was it was very costly. I mean, it was costly enough that the Chinese government at some point started bringing in and reducing the subsidies because it was going, it was just too much. So I think that just complicates the question, and I think complicates the answer, right? And I don't know that we know exactly how this is going to play out for competition. I mean, I think in a way, a certain level of commercial competition is a good thing, right? We should welcome American companies competing with successful companies from other countries because we expect them to become better, right? These are, but obviously the question is how unfair is this competition? And I think that's the more complicated question. Is more complicated to assess. I mean, I think, Scott, you're the first one to say that many of these subsidies were very wasteful and didn't actually succeed in they didn't really get to the they were wasted, right? They weren't actually that successful in bringing these companies forward, but in some cases they were really, really good for these companies and really helped these companies move forward. So I think it's a question of identifying where there's good companies and where there's good companies just because they had subsidies, right?
Yes. And we always, when there's subsidies and government spending, you can definitely see the failures. It's very easy. When there's market failure and companies crash and burn because they weren't good, then you say, well, that's sort of a natural Schumpeterian weeding out of the bad companies, and you don't consider that a cost. But so John Paul, Chinese subsidies, 1 trillion renminbi, whatever the giant monster number, catalyst for the world that if we didn't have, we wouldn't have the future that you and Ilaria just described, or really problematic because it involves so much waste and is also getting Washington to consider spending a bunch of money that we don't have.
Yeah, again, tough question. But I would give a few observations about China from, my perspective as not an expert China watcher, but it's been important to pay attention. Yes, I mean, I don't think again, it's hard to say. Tesla needed to succeed to get the world's attention. China building the world's largest EV market needed to happen maybe to get the world's attention. Which is most important? They're intertwined, as we've already said. I've been impressed to see China showing a sort of versatility and flexibility about its policies that I might not have expected, including cutting back, as Ilaria said, on subsidies at a point that they thought they were too high. This newer policy that involves some credits, which are a different way of encouraging competition towards electric vehicles that brings in the foreign automakers. Absolutely. I think that's another piece. The Chinese governments obviously want a national champion in electric vehicles that succeeds in export markets in a way they haven't with traditional vehicles. They want a leapfrogging strategy around this new technology, but they're not really you couldn't say in any way that they're keeping foreign companies out. They've been there with their JVs, they are now encouraging those same companies to make electric vehicles in China with Chinese components. They gave Tesla, I think this was the first time, a license to open a new plant without having a joint venture partner.
Right.
And that was a really, kind of a breakthrough. I don't know if Tesla would have agreed otherwise to do it, but then that helped Tesla really quickly, double its scale, export to Europe from Shanghai, convince a lot of people that they had a global model that was going to be successful. So these are all signs of Chinese government flexibility. I attended a webinar with a bunch of European researchers about the Chinese battery industry, and that's another area where there's been massive subsidies. There's arguably massive overcapacity or way too many small companies, maybe some, encouraged to get into it when they're not really a good fit or they're not going to be that successful. But there too, they're starting to scale back on subsidies and push towards some consolidation in that area. And of course, in batteries, the big story is the scale and global expansion of CATL, right? So, so anyway, what does this mean for the U.S.? I mostly think the sense of competition between China and the U.S. right now is probably good, because it is affecting not only how the U.S. government and states are thinking about, playing some role in the diffusion, but it's affecting these corporate strategies in a big way. For GM and Ford, well, GM particularly, and Volkswagen, let's say, to make these massive commitments to percentages of electric vehicles for the future, it makes sense for them, not just on the premise of the US market growing rapidly, but because they are global auto manufacturers and the Chinese market is huge and the EU market is growing fast. So for them to scale up, they need that global demand, and to see the forces pushing it, including some policy forces, helps justify their investments, which means this is a public-private shared investment domain.
Yeah, I guess, yeah, I mean, you both make very, very good points. And it's not glass half full or half empty. There's strengths and weaknesses. To me, a really important measure of success is, after there is all of the state support, do you get a vibrant industry? And are there, do consumers have lots of choices? They don't have to go with just one supplier or another, that there are multiple winners in this. Because if just one side wins and another loses, then that feels discriminatory, and the distributional effects are going to make it so that one side just opposes the other. But so the policies where foreign companies already were significant in China and weren't explicitly locked out, I think that's probably helped a lot, incentivize them. I'm a little bit more worried on the battery side, where you have a much smaller number of large battery makers, no big dominant US producer. It's basically CATL, Samsung, LG, Panasonic, some others, but still not at scale. And so I feel like that's one area where we could see significant pushback, or people wondering. Let me ask now about one last thing, and there's been some very good questions that the audience has raised. So as Ilaria mentioned before, the Chinese have just started exporting electric vehicles. And I think 5 years ago, their primary markets were India and Bangladesh, but now they're starting to export to Europe some, and I know that they would at some point like to export to the United States. Do y'all see electric vehicle trade war coming? Do you expect folks in this town where I work and Ilaria works to call their lobbyists to add tariffs onto imported vehicles or restrict Chinese investment around the world? I know they've invested a lot in Europe already. What you all described sound like a relatively good public policy outcome, but I do think it is certainly possible that there will be fights about this. How likely do you think it's going to be that we might see a conflict in electric vehicles the way we've seen it, say, in steel, or in semiconductors that the US and Japan previously had, or some of the tariff fights that the US and China have been having lately? Will EVs get pulled into those kinds of conflicts, or do you expect this to be relatively protection-free, a protection-free zone? Ilaria, do you have a thought about that? And then John Paul?
So I actually think that's an interesting question to be asking today, because we've seen so much activity on the solar tariff front these past few days. And I think, inflation has become now such a concern, as well as the Biden administration's, the challenges it's had in meeting its climate commitments. So I think, I think to answer your question, I think on the battery front, I actually don't think we'll probably see tariffs, right? I suspect that the Biden administration will hesitate because of how we've seen them react to sort of what's been happening on the solar front. With EVs as a whole, I think that's more complicated because, of course, there's no big U.S. battery maker, and we are highly reliant on supply chains from China. But if it were to be an actual EV maker, say BYD, we've actually seen this happen in some ways with the BYD buses. BYD has a factory in California, and it was excluded from receiving federal funding, right? Because on national security grounds. So I do see that more. I see it much more. I see it much more challenging for the actual final product, the actual car, to be sold in the U.S. I think that's going to be much tougher. We could see some restrictions there. I don't know if we'll see a EV war, but we might see restrictions. But I think when it comes to components, I don't think this administration, especially now in this inflationary environment, I think they'll hesitate to introduce tariffs. But I'm basing that off of this latest news, but I may be wrong.
Yeah. John Paul, are you less optimistic that we'll avoid a conflict?
Well, so I guess with batteries, Ford and GM are announcing massive battery expansions with Korean partners, right? LG Chem, SK Innovation, Tesla, of course, working with Panasonic. The US companies don't want to be overly dependent on Chinese battery makers, and so they're pushing a lot of this new investment towards the Korean and Japanese battery suppliers. So you could say, oh, well, where's our American battery maker? But it's at least keeping competition in the battery sector in a way that prevents, Chinese domination and then possible backlash about that. In terms of vehicles, I mean, I think, solar panels become a commodity. Steel, some aspects become a commodity. I mean, no one in the world really makes SUVs and pickups the way that the US consumers like them. Or if they do, they make them in the US, right? Toyota makes its Tundra in the US. They don't try to make it anywhere else and sell it. There's this build where you sell logic for the global automotive industry that's not really dictated by necessity. I mean, you can build a car anywhere and put it on in the past, we would say put it on a ship and it'll get there in a short amount of time. It's a little harder now, but there's a million reasons why you build where you sell. You do it to shorten your supply chains for just-in-time inventory, but you also do it to build a local brand, to convince people that you're a domestic, you're invested in domestic manufacturing and the like. Every single foreign automaker that has wanted to have a piece of the US market has built factories in the US. And the Chinese that may be ultimately how they break into the US market too. They have some models that are appealing enough and they build factories in the US to get it there. So I think the fact that the product markets are so differentiated, the fact that there is this build where you sell logic that's been dominant in the industry for so long. I just don't see, you've got Tesla welcomed into China as opposed to being kept out, right, to protect NIO and some of the other, Lucid, some of the other high-end Chinese makers. I just don't really see this as a prime place for a tariff battle between the US and China.
Yeah. Just to play devil's advocate, just to give folks another way to think about this, I do think that the build where you sell, or sell where you build, makes a lot of sense. I also think that if we're just looking at this as a political economy or interest group activity, the fact that GM and Ford and Tesla have access to the Chinese market and supply chains there are going to make them hesitate to push Congress to block Chinese outright, because the Chinese market is 5 times the size of ours, right? So so they want to stay in both markets. This may be where interdependence really plays a role in restricting protectionist impulses. I would say if there's a place where we haven't talked about yet, where I would wonder is, electric vehicles are electric vehicles. That's the powertrain, right? But the way the auto sector is going entirely is towards autonomous vehicles, interconnected vehicles, that basically your car is a computer. It is it's connected to the internet. It is collecting information about you, about your environment, your surroundings. And if there is one place where there's an allergy about Chinese related companies in the United States, it's about them collecting information about consumers and others. And so I think to the extent that electric vehicles just remain an electric vehicle, there's probably less arguments. But if they are collecting information, processing information, analyzing it, providing you TikTok over your screen or other types of things, selling you stuff, then I could see the national security intelligence side of Washington, D.C., both on the Hill and in the executive, raising concerns. And Ilaria got to that a little bit before when talking about buses, electric buses at BYD. That was also one of the arguments about, I guess it was also Chinese rail maker when they were trying to sell subway cars in the US, that this was an argument, worried about privacy and data. And I could totally see this coming up, that if these other avenues don't arise. So I do think that it's going to be a challenge then for Chinese automakers to explain and figure out how they're going to reassure American policymakers that they are not going to be avenues for misusing private data. So I think that's something that I would be on the lookout for from Washington, because it's just something that's talked about in a lot of other contexts that could be here. Let me turn to a couple of the questions that have come in. One is about electric vehicle battery recycling. So we talk about electric vehicles as being green, but they are made of a bunch of chemicals in those batteries, and batteries don't last forever. And you have to do something with the chemicals that go into them. Also, you have to get the chemicals from someplace, and that process also is not perfectly aligned with everything that we want. So maybe if you could give us your thoughts about the potential non-green elements of the electric vehicle industry at the front end of mining chemicals, and on the back end of the need for what to do with batteries and possibilities for recycling. Are these public policy issues that could just be solved by smart policies in Washington and Beijing, or is it going to be more complicated to address these? John Paul, why don't we start with you and then have Ilaria offer her feedback as well?
Yeah, sure. So let me start at the end of life, the recycling issue, where you started, and then I'll back up to the beginning of the supply chain. I think there's several factors that intersect to make me a bit more optimistic about even some market-driven paths forward here. So one is that the batteries and their efficiency in a vehicle do start to tail off at a certain point after a certain number of years, and we're still learning about that. But they're not done with their useful life as batteries at all at that point. So there are business models about repurposing old EV batteries, combined, wired together, new kinds of software management systems for all kinds of backup purposes, whether it's for individual homes, whether it's for municipalities, whether it's for grid kinds of power storage and the like. And then finally, given that there are concerns about the supply of some of the minerals and chemicals that go into batteries in the first place, there's actually a lot of incentive to really recycle the battery at the end of life and return and be able to use some of those raw materials again. And of course, there's a lot of investment pouring into that now. I expect we'll see a lot of technical change that will increase the efficiency of that. And so given that it relieves the crunch at the front end of the supply chain, given that there are these multi-uses of EV batteries in the general electrification of the economy, which is being driven again by many different forces, I actually see some kind of promising developments there. And then I'll just say one quick example on the front end. Nickel, manganese, cobalt battery design, lithium battery design has been the most common so far, particularly in the higher range batteries, so-called NMC. Cobalt is problematic. It's limited in supply. It's concentrated in the Congo. There are human rights concerns and child labor concerns. Nickel, more abundant, but still a limited overall resource. Automakers are starting to use different battery chemistries that use no cobalt and use no nickel. And actually, China has been a bit of a leader in this, not so much by design, but by the fact that an older battery chemistry called LFP for lithium ferro iron phosphate was really important for the small end of the electric vehicle market, including golf carts and things like that. And now Tesla's Model 3, first in China and now in the US, is using some of the Model 3s are using this LFP chemistry. Ford's made big announcements about LFP. So if we're at a point in the technology, the battery, where you can innovate your way around the worst of the supply chain problem simply by going to different battery chemistries, that's great, because then we don't get into this zero-sum thing about everybody fighting over, the dwindling supply of cobalt as its price rises.
Ilaria, give you a chance to weigh in on this on the Chinese side. By luck, by public policy, trying to find some of these solutions?
Yeah, no, I would completely agree with John Paul that there's some market elements, just I think the costs right now of some of these resources is going to be a major driver. And I think it's been a real incentive. There are public policy, there are, I think Europe has done better than China in some ways in terms of implementation, but China itself has been exploring and trying to introduce more rules on recycling and better end of life management. I think the devil is in the details, right? I mean, this is also a pollution issue. It's a implementation enforcement issue as well. So I think it's going to continue to be an issue. That said, I think it's not unsolvable, right? And there can be rapid improvements. So hopefully we'll see more of that.
Well, my big takeaway from this hour is I started a lot less optimistic than when I finished, and both of you made me feel like the glass is more than half full, because there's been some important technological innovations. Industrial policy has been a catalyst to encourage additional competition, not just one side. And there's some of the challenges of the industry that a lot of effort is going into. There are obviously still some significant problems, and I don't know if we've gotten to the point beyond, and the industry will just continue to develop no matter what. But we're in a better space than I figured, and it's hard to make me optimistic usually, because I live and work in Washington, D.C., and I work on U.S. China relations, where being pessimistic is a sport, and usually a reasonable bet. So I appreciate the conversation that we've had today, simply because it's put me in a better mood, and hopefully those watching as well. Real challenges still to deal with, but some good reasons for optimism. So I want to thank you both for helping us understand this really interesting sector. and this part of U.S. China relations. I'll turn things back to Tom to wrap things up.
Well, thank you very much. I want to thank our two speakers today, John Paul MacDuffie and Ilaria Mazzocco, for explaining the opportunities and challenges associated with the rise of EVs in the United States and China, as well as Scott Kennedy, who is a fellow with our Public Intellectuals program, who has moderated the conversation very well. Special thanks also to BlackBerry for its sponsorship of this two-part series on electric vehicles. I would just ask the audience, if you like this event, please visit our website, ncuscr.org, to find out all our latest programming. Also, be sure to fill out the post-event evaluations we will send to you shortly. Thanks and goodbye.